Rob Henderson, welcome to the show.
Armin, great to be here.
Glad to have you on. I check your material regularly. I am checking it way too often on Twitter. I am reading it. You have great tweets, a lot of insight. It's so valuable. You post a lot. Then you have your newsletter. Value across the board. You're one of the few people that makes subscriptions make sense on the internet. And then now you have a book that is coming, which is Troubled. Before we get into all of that, how do you traverse through the world? How do you describe how Rob Henderson travels through the world?
How I travel through the world. In terms of how I arrived at this point, I can give you the sort of short version, and we can see where it goes. You can ask, specific points, but right now I'm based in Cambridge, England. I did a PhD at the University of Cambridge. Finished a little over a year ago. Before that, I did a degree at Yale. And before my experiences at these universities and as a writer and someone with some online presence, my life was a lot different. So my book Troubled covers the sort of what I've described it on my Substack as like the first 31 years of my life with all the boring parts removed. It's just sort of the most vivid stories and recollections from being born into poverty in Los Angeles. I never knew my father. The first 3 years of my life, I lived with my birth mother. She didn't know who my father was either. A lot of this information I got from documents from social workers later as an adult, sort of trying to piece together those early years of my life. And so, my mother and I lived in a car. We were homeless for a time. Eventually, we settled in this slum apartment out in Los Angeles. And she was very heavily addicted to drugs and was just mentally not in a position to take care of me, very neglectful. At a certain point, the police were called because my mom would basically tie me to, I was 3 years old. She would tie me to this chair with a bathrobe belt while she would be in her room getting high, or she would be, she would have various people over, a lot of men come over to the apartment, and she would trade favors for drugs. So eventually some neighbors heard me screaming, struggling to break free from this chair, and the police arrived and saw the kind of squalor and disorder of this apartment and, took me into foster care. My mother she was from South Korea. She came to the U.S. as a young woman. She was deported back to Seoul. I had no information about my father until later as an adult. I took a 23andMe DNA test. And, my whole life I didn't know, my father, his ancestry, his ethnicity, anything. So this 23andMe, I get these results, and it turns out my father is he's Mexican with ancestry from, it's, the way the 23andMe results break down, it's like, indigenous, North American something, and then Spain. And, I was born in LA, and I showed my results to a geneticist friend of mine, and he was like, your dad, he's mestizo, he's probably Mexican. And so that was my father's side. I had no idea about this growing up, this sort of side of my ancestry. Anyway, so I spent the next several years living in different foster homes in Los Angeles, lived in 7 different homes in LA. Later was adopted. We settled into this dusty kind of working class town in Northern California. But there was, there were divorces and separations and all this sort of family drama after I was adopted, where I sort of got, I talk a lot in the book about this. It gave me sort of this front row seat to what was happening in like rural sort of, this is Northern California, kind of a rural working class environment in the late 90s and early 2000s. Sort of the glimpses into what was happening with opioids and addiction and domestic abuse and divorce, and sort of what's happening in this sort of bottom segment of society that often gets overlooked. And, then from there, I enlisted in the military, joined the Air Force when I was 17. And then from there, there were some setbacks and hiccups and so on, but eventually I found my way into college and kind of left those very sort of upsetting and chaotic environments. And so the book just covers that story, the lessons I learned, my observations of where I came from, and then my experiences at elite universities and what I witnessed there. kind of witnessed, this was 2015 when I arrived at Yale, so sort of the birth of what is now called wokeness and this new sort of politically correct movement on campus. And sort of my thoughts and reflections on that. And then I just, it's a sort of a sweeping book about, this very kind of strange life that I've lived.
It is a strange one, but not really. We all have a strange one in some way. When I was reading it, some parts of it made me sad. I connected with it. It was actually saddening, which is not common for me when I read a book. And part of the reason for that was the level of detail that you brought to the parts. You remembered the story. How did you get the detail of all the scenarios? Because each one, you're like, I'm there. Okay, now I'm there. Now I'm there. How did you remember all that?
I remember when I first signed to do this book, and then sort of realizing what it would entail, because I'd written, I had a newsletter at that time. I'd written sort of op-eds and different things for different outlets, but this is, 1,000 words, 1,500 words, but then a book is 80,000 words. And when I realized how, in my mind, this task just seemed impossible. So I talked to other authors and tried to sort of get a sense of how to actually approach this book. And finally, there was one author who told me, the question for memoir isn't who am I, but who am I in this story? And for whatever reason, that unlocked something for me, where I realized, I'm not writing a book sort of retrospectively saying, oh, here are my thoughts about these events, or sort of, this account of, as an adult speaking about or offering commentary about these environments, but rather what I needed to do was to sort of go back to that time and offer some perspective from the eyes of a young person going through these. So as a child, so what each chapter does is sort of, I describe my experiences from that specific age. So, age 3 living with my birth mother, or age 7 living in the foster homes, or 17 growing up in Red Bluff, California, or, my late teens, early 20s in the military. And so what I try to do is, here's what I remember from this time, and here's the sort of firsthand account of people I was interacting with, and what a day in the life was like here, and some of the more sort of vivid memories that I had. It was hard. It was hard to remember everything. I went back and spoke with some of my old friends when I was growing up. I talked to my adoptive sister. She and I grew up together later after I was adopted. I spoke with, just family and friends. I also this was during the lockdown initially when I was writing it. But then, so what I would buy food that I was eating as a kid. I would listen to the music of that time. I'd listen to whatever, Biggie or Tupac, or I'd eat cheap, generic Pop-Tarts from Walmart, or, I was trying to sort of I wanted to smell and taste and hear and just sort of bring myself back to those periods. And that was effective, actually, to sort of spark and rekindle those memories. There was a period where I was I'd be sleeping, and then I'd dream of a memory from when I was 12, and I'm like, man, I haven't thought about that in years. I forgot about that. And so I'd bolt awake at 2 or 3 a.m. and run to my laptop. I got to get this down before I forget, and I would corroborate it, anytime something happened with a family member, I was do you remember it this way? And most of it, most of the accounts aligned. There were it was weird. There were minor details that were different, where I'd ask my adoptive mom, I would say, hey, do you remember when you and I had that conversation? We were sitting in the car, and it was after dark, and my mom would say well, we had that conversation, but we were actually sitting on a porch, and it was the afternoon, and the sun was shining. Okay, so we remember the same conversation, but the peripheral details were a bit different, where I thought, we're in a car, and we're okay, but the conversation was more or less the same. So that was actually nice to know that okay, I know memory is flawed, but at least this is, as close to the truth as, a subjective recollective account could probably be. And so, yeah, it was, just a lot of sort of thinking and reflecting and playing these little sort of tricks with my senses, with the food and the music and everything. And it ended up being pretty effective.
I would agree, because when I was reading it, the effectiveness was transmitted. The smells and the music was very noticeable, especially the music in the book, because I know all the songs you mentioned. So I'm connecting with the exact actual category. Usually when there's references in something, I don't connect with the movies or the music. But in this case, anything you were mentioning,
Space Jam,
Space
Kazam,
Jam.
yeah.
Forgot about Dre.
Bone Thugs and Harmony,
Bone
forgot
Thugs
about
and
Dre.
Harmony.
Yeah, dude. I mean, these were like music was just better back then, honestly. Like, because I had this Spotify playlist that I would go like play music from 1999 to 2002 or whatever, and I'm like, man, the music was so good back then, and now it's. But this happens, like if you read research on like the psychology of sort of music preferences and stuff, usually our music preferences tend to sort of harden and cement like in the early adolescent years. And so like, okay, that was like when I was 5. Like I still think objectively the music was better.
I've rapped on a lot of the beats of the music that you mentioned in the. I freestyle a lot, so
All right.
or I used to do it a lot more. So it was a nice connection when I started.
All right, cool. Yeah.
Now you mentioned adolescence, those early years. How you mentioned in the book later on that you would give up your 1% success academically or whatnot to not have the 1% level anguish of the early years. How impactful are those early years, like 0 to 5, 0 to 10? Is that once somebody goes through that, is it like burned in? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a point that I made in my book, was that there's a lot of discussion in the US about upward social mobility, about how to get more kids from deprived backgrounds into college and get them into higher paying jobs, and sort of concentration on inequality and poverty, which and I make this point too, which is that like those are good goals. Like I'm not saying we should discount that or ignore it, but I just think it does to some extent sort of gloss over more important questions about what are we actually aiming for here. Is it to just get more people with bachelor's degrees, or is it to actually ensure that people are healthy and happy, and to improve their well-being, life satisfaction, those things? And for a lot of kids, I mean, regardless of wherever they end up in their lives, whether they do achieve upward mobility or not, they're still going to be carrying the wounds, or in the best case scenario, the scars of their early childhood. Like the guys that I grew up with, whether in foster homes or just in more sort of typical chaotic environments with single moms or multiple step parents, or just like living with a grandmother because their dad is in prison and their mom went on a bender and is now addicted. I mean, those were very common stories where I grew up in California. And so one line that I write is that even if every foster kid goes on to have the same life as me, they're still going to be dealing with those very upsetting early life experiences. And so when you look at the developmental psychology research, the first 5 to 7 years of a person's life are critical in terms of how they go on to form attachments, or how they feel about themselves, their beliefs, their level of inner resources, how confident they feel that they can accomplish tasks in the world, whether they go on to have healthy and successful romantic relationships, whether they go on to trust or be more suspicious of others, their friends, their family, and so relationships are critical for happiness. How kids are raised, how safe and secure they feel when they're growing up, those are critical. And so for someone like me, I mean, I had a lot of the sort of the raw ingredients were in place for me to maybe go on to college, or maybe go on to achieve those sort of conventional measures of success. But I was weighed down by so many upsetting and difficult early life experiences that even for someone like me, it took a lot of work, a lot of sort of focus and repair and healing and all of these things before I finally got to a point where I believed in myself enough to go on to actually do the things that I wanted to do in my life. There are a reason why a lot of apparently bright and curious kids and teenagers engage in self-defeating behaviors, or seem to intentionally commit actions that they know that they'll regret later. I mean, that's the thing, right? Like even under the best of circumstances, it's still hard to make good decisions. Like even if everything is going in your favor, sometimes it's still hard to do the thing that you should do. I mean, I think I have this simple example somewhere in the book, or this might have been in a Substack post, where I basically said, like, everyone knows, for example, that vegetables are good for you. The knowledge is there. We all know this. But for whatever, people will still order the fries instead of the side salad. Everyone knows smoking's bad for them, but they'll still smoke. I mean, you can have the knowledge and the information, but if you don't have the right sort of incentives and structures and positive environment and positive influences and so on, then it's very easy to just sort of fall into this pattern of making bad choices. And so, I kind of sum it up by saying that, when you're a kid and adults repeatedly let you down, eventually you start learning to let yourself down. And that's what happened.
A punchy statement that is in the book and very accurate, because that's what you're getting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing that came to mind while you're describing this is care. Mm-hmm. When you're young, you're looking for some sort of care or love. You may not have had that many examples of it in your youth. I remember one that you brought up with a girl when you went to the new house, and she's like, "You can play with my toys. You can have them." And you're just like, "Oh wow, this is what a warm moment." You look for those kinds of things, and it gives you like, "Oh, I do matter," and that contributes to the belief in self, which also I think contributes to more of an internal locus of control than external. I think. What are your thoughts on reaching for care as a person, and then which also connects to later in life, you reach for status and authority so that you feel acceptance. It's almost like another form of care there. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. So that was my adoptive sister. After shortly after I was adopted, she gave me some of her toys, and she was just like really nice to me. And like when I was in the foster homes, I never had toys. There was I remember at one time I moved to a foster home and I found this this toy from the Mighty Ducks. It was a Mighty Ducks hockey puck. These were like popular movies in the 90s. It was from a McDonald's Happy Meal, and it was some kid had left it. Some previous foster kid who left it under this bed. I had it for a little while. We played with it. We were playing street hockey with it. Me and this girl across the street. We ended up busting it. It was like kind of already brittle, and we ended up breaking it. But that was the one kind of toy that I did not have for very long. But otherwise, no toys. And so those moments of kindness stuck with me. They were very fleeting, very rare. Later, I do think like some people will try to, and I think to some extent I tried to do this too, is like you're chasing success, you're chasing whatever it is, money or promotions or validation in some way to sort of make up for those things. One thing that it's been surprising and gratifying to see actually is like, I wondered who would connect with this book, as a, like there would, the kind of book reading public, people who maybe didn't have the same kind of life experiences as me, would they connect with it in the same way? And what I'm finding is like a lot of people are, and I think that's because like, I could talk to a friend of mine the other day. He read my book, and he was like, when I was growing up, he grew up like kind of upper middle class, and he said his parents, all they seemed to care about was that he and his brother would go to college, and it was like extracurriculars and practice and all these kinds of things, checking the right boxes. And he said, like, I felt like very little like love or warmth from my parents. It was like every decision was optimized for the binary, is this going to get you into college? Yes or no? And that's all. It was like that was the whole, outlook of the family. And so he ended up he and his brother went to good colleges, got good paying jobs. They're on paper, their resumes, they're very successful, but they have like this ambivalent relationship with their parents and how they view friendship and relationships. And like they tried to achieve success in some part, hoping to maybe win the affection of their parents. Like, I did the thing you wanted to do, but it feels very hollow. It feels very transactional. It doesn't actually satisfy that feeling. And, it was at first it was surprising, but I understood it. Like I understood that, even if you don't have the same kind of, outsized, pronounced levels of drama that I had, just, that those early life relationships you have with your family do set a template for how you view yourself and others in the world. And so it's been interesting to see that people, you don't have to grow up poor to have these experiences. I make that point in the book somewhere that, a lot of people who grow up rich will at least attempt to imagine what it's like to be poor. They try to take on the perspective of someone who grew up in poverty. I've never met anyone who grew up with, relatively happy family lives, with their parents, who have tried to imagine what it would be like to grow up without them. And so I think that in the same way that when you grow up rich, you take wealth for granted, when you grow up with, a happy, loving family, you learn to take that for granted too. And you don't even consider what it would be like for people who didn't have that and the sort of downstream effects that could have. And it's interesting to me that we'll focus on the sort of economic poverty, but not the sort of social and emotional poverty of kids who lack, stability and security in their early lives.
You're bringing up very important points of not hitting the main thing that's important to a person for well-being. So it's sort of like the parent that says, if you do this and this and this, they're coming from a place of, well, I would have wanted to do this, this, and this. I put that on you now. That will give you the stability I didn't have. But there's a bit of a disconnect because you don't exist in that. It's just this, this, and this, and you showed up, and we need to put that on you, and you should be good. And there's not really much of you in it. It's almost a disconnecting feature. And then, but to completely ignore it would be to say, oh, you're taking it for granted how they have set things up better for you. There's that conundrum back and forth. But is there something of a disconnect to it when things are placed on you that you should meet these criteria, but it's not really asking you what speaks to you, where your energy comes from?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important question. I mean, it's hard. I mean, one of the I mean, just trying to check the boxes, trying to achieve those badges of success. I mean, these aren't even like bad things to do, right? Like, I think they're oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes it's better than not having those things. But there's this line about how what is it? What gets measured gets managed. What can be counted and quantified. That's those are the things that we optimize for, and especially people who work in like education policy or people who care about outcomes for struggling kids or people who are marginalized or impoverished in some ways. Just more degrees or more money or more success in some form that we can easily measure. But there's this other line that I like, and some people attribute it to Einstein. I actually don't think, it's like one of these apocryphal things. There's this what is it called? I think it's called like the Churchill effect or something, where like, if there's a popular saying, eventually it'll just get attributed to more and more famous people till eventually people are like, oh, that was Churchill, that was Einstein, that was, this line is, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And so this idea that, just because you can measure it doesn't mean it's important. And if something is important doesn't necessarily mean that it can be measured. And I think something like childhood subjective well-being, for example, like it's difficult to measure on the one, because you can't like accurately necessarily measure like some 5-year-old's level of well-being. I think we're pretty good at knowing when a kid's doing very badly, though, and we could also, try to create situations in which that's mitigated. But it just seems like, a point that I make repeatedly in the book is there's just all of this concentration on economics and financial need. And again, those are important things, but if you look at the research in developmental and evolutionary psychology, and you want to know sort of what are the predictors for as a young adult, what are the predictors for substance abuse or incarceration or self-harm or committing sort of self-defeating or violent undesirable acts, the link between those behaviors and childhood poverty, it's pretty tenuous, actually. Sometimes there's a weak correlation, and sometimes there's no correlation at all between growing up poor and committing those kinds of acts. But what researchers consistently find is that childhood instability is a strong and reliable predictor of undesirable actions later in life, regrettable actions later, again, incarceration, substance abuse, and so forth. And so childhood instability is measured by things like how frequently you relocated as a young person growing up, whether you were raised by two parents, how frequently your parents sort of separated, remarried, how many different adults were moving in and out of your home, how much day-to-day uncertainty there was in your life, how predictable it was. And so, scoring high on those kinds of measures, which are kind of related. I mean, some people are familiar with the ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences. It's not quite the same thing, but it's similar to that. If you've had a lot of those experiences, that does predict negative behaviors later in life. And so, I took that childhood instability scale, and I scored well into the top 1% of most unstable childhoods in America, which is like kind of unsurprising, right? I lived like in total like 10 different homes, multiple, foster homes, divorces, separate. There's just a lot of drama that I talk about in the book. And so I make this point that, I'm roughly in the top 1% in terms of like educational attainment, with a PhD from a fancy college and so on. But I would gladly trade my position in the top 1% of whatever, like success stories for social mobility to have never been in the top 1% of most unstable homes. I don't think the trade-off is worth it. People use this, they people who've had, some transformative experiences, or, these journeys. Some people will say, I'm glad that I went through everything I did because it made me who I am today. And it's a nice line, and I understand it. And there was a period where I really wanted to believe that. But ultimately, I just, at least in my case, and I think for a lot of kids who grew up the way that I did, and even if they, they had successful lives, I think that the trade-off isn't worth it. I actually disagree with that sentiment. Even though it can be true for any particular person, I think, though, in general, it's actually not true. That if you, if given the choice, I'd rather not. I would rather have, some people say, they've told me, like, Rob, you had such a unusual story, and it probably built a lot of character. And I would say, I'd rather have a little less character and had a little bit better of a childhood. So.
That resonates strongly with me. I've had some level of chaos as well in youth, and gave me some superpowers later, I would say. But I've thought about the same. Would I go back to the way I was beforehand? I would give up my superpowers to go back, but I wouldn't want to give them up now that I have them and those things happen. Yeah. I'll take them and go.
Yeah.
But there was more of a wholeness before that. That was nice, and you can't really get that back. Once it's not there, you don't have that same wholeness. It has a little bit of that concept of like a glass that broke, and then you can tape it back together, but it doesn't hold water anymore. It's not the same. It's kind of like, and then I wonder, where are the trade-offs that are worth it? They say, I was talking with somebody recently about for relationships. Let's say you had a relationship for half a year, and it was great, and then it ended roughly, and then now you're in a less joyous state, maybe for an extended period of time. Is it better to have loved and have lost than to not at all? In that case, maybe not. How do you decide these trade-offs of early life chaos, later superpower, a love experience? It ended. Would you have done it in the first place at all?
I mean, so it's interesting. I think for like the romantic relationship example, it's an interesting one. I think it's a good actually way to think about this, because I think that if you, as an adult, or as a person with agency, if you enter a situation or make a decision with some knowledge of, some awareness that it may not go the way that you want it to go, I think that's one thing. And maybe it is better, because you made a decision and you learned to live with the consequences, and, maybe you can use the outcome of that decision to sort of inform future behavior, future ideas, thinking, and future actions. But I think for a child, like you don't make that choice, right? Like you're thrown into the world, and you didn't get to decide who, you're just, you have no real agency, you have no power over your life. I mean, that was something that I discuss when I enlisted in the military. I mean, there were a lot of reasons why I did that, but one was just like, finally I can make my own decision. Like my whole life, every sort of aspect of my life had been controlled by social workers and, teachers and foster parents and adoptive parents and all of these people who maybe in the moment at some level may have at least thought of my best interests, but ultimately, it ended up going in a very bad direction, and, just feeling extremely unhappy for most of my upbringing, that I could finally make this decision. And what's really funny though is that, like, I made this decision, but I guess this sort of does circle back to this point that I made about, like, if you're going to make the decision, and even if the outcome doesn't go the way you want, or it's like less than optimal, at least you made the call, and you can use this to inform your life. Is that when I joined the military, it was like, again, my choices were stripped from me, and I was being controlled again, because the military is this vast, bureaucratic, strong, rigid, just every aspect of your life is tightly controlled. But in a way that was actually good for me, because it was controlled in a way that would allow me to sort of develop and grow and learn good habits and skills and self-discipline and the mindset required to accomplish hard things. And it was my call, right? Like it was weird. Like there were, especially like the first couple of years, it's just miserable as like brand new recruit. Just everything just sucks, man. Like your life, is your uniform perfect? Is your room clean? Is your bed made? Is your every little thing has to be perfect when you're in training? And then, so I hated it, but in the back of my mind, I was like, well, you did this. Like, this is your fault. It's like, and in a way that was almost like, okay, like, fine. Like, I'm the one who did this. I'm responsible. And it was almost relief in a way that, like, I'm the one who, rather than like being trapped in a, another foster home that you didn't want to go to, that you had no say in, that you just had all of your agency stripped from you. Whereas in the military, it was the reverse, where like, yeah, maybe I wasn't as informed as I could have been or should have been when I signed up, but this was my choice, and I'm going to make the most of it. So it's just kind of different ways to think about it.
Strong point on agency there. We want to feel like we are causing the thing, whether we are in a free will or determined world. We do feel like we are toward that. Like, okay, I caused this versus it just happened to me. It was out of my hands. Like, I thought about like the audience versus the person on stage. If you're in the audience, you can be replaced because anybody could just get things coming at them. But if you're on stage, you can't be replaced. Everybody went to the show for that person. Yeah. So it's not as inspiring. You could put the other person there. So are you really that relevant right there?
Yeah. Well, even just having, like, even if you don't exert the agency or the control, even just having the option available it seems to have some effect. I mean, there was a really cool study decades ago, which basically, so these researchers created kind of two conditions, and in one condition, they had these participants perform a moderately difficult task with an obnoxious alarm blaring in the background. And they just asked them, there's this alarm, and we're just going to ask you to like solve this puzzle, essentially. And in the other condition, it was the same, where they told these participants, obnoxious alarm in the background, we're going to ask you to solve this moderately difficult task. But they told them, look, there's a button over there by that desk. And if the noise gets to be too much, you press the button and it'll stop. But we really need you to at least attempt, right? We would like for you to try to accomplish the task with the alarm going. This is part of the study. But if you really need to, you can press the button. Nobody pressed the button. They still attempted to solve the task. Nobody pressed the button. And what they found was that the second group outperformed the first group, despite the objective conditions being the same, right? Like, both groups had this alarm in the background and they had to solve the task. And again, in the second group, nobody pushed the button, but having the knowledge that they could stop the, what the researchers call the unpleasant stimulus, just knowing that they could eliminate it was enough for their minds to be settled to the point where they could concentrate on something and accomplish it. I just think, like, having a bit of that control and agency, even if you don't exercise it, but knowing that you could, even that has some, non-trivial effect on our lives. I think it's, this is just a simple project, a simple task, but I think it's intuitively understandable for every sort of decision we make or circumstance we find ourselves in.
We want to increase that feeling. If we don't have it, we want to get it. And if we do have some of it, we want to expand on that because we like the feeling of that. Like, oh, okay, I have a choice here. I could do that. Even if I don't do all the options. Option 3, all right, I could reach for it too. Okay, cool. Versus I have to be hit repeatedly, and then it's out of my hands somewhat. It's not very inspiring or motivating. Where did you most develop optionality? One was when you went to the military. How else have you developed that so you have more belief in yourself? What points?
Yeah, I mean, there were sort of different points even before the military where, I realized, like, there was a connection between effort and focus and concentration and positive outcomes. But it was so rare that I would actually notice those connections, especially as a kid, because there weren't many adults around. There was not a lot of supervision. But I did for a time. I was at this boxing gym, so the coach taught Muay Thai and boxing, and I would go there, and I would, like, after 6 months or a year, and I noticed, like, my body was changing and my concentration was increased, and I just felt like a more capable person through sort of going to practice and going through those training sessions. So I think, like, that was probably one of the early moments where I realized this. Others. There was, the military was an important one too. Was, one thing that I learned there was this distinction between motivation versus self-discipline, which was that, especially when I was a teenager, you sort of you hear this kind of in your day-to-day life, or maybe you've experienced it too, which is, you want to do something, maybe you want to go to the gym, or you want to go to work, or you want to do your side hustle or something, but you don't feel motivated. I lack motivation. I don't feel motivated. But what I learned when I was in the Air Force was that self-discipline is more important than motivation, because motivation is just a feeling. Motivation just lives up here, just in your, it's just an internal state. But self-discipline is, I'm going to do this regardless of how I feel. And what really matters in the world is your actions. What are you actually propelling yourself forward to do? Even if inside you're like, I don't feel motivated. I don't want to go to the gym. I don't want to work out. But in terms of like, observable real world effects, it doesn't matter what you're thinking or what you're feeling. It's like, are you in the gym regardless of how miserable you feel? And, you string enough of those days together and, you'll be in better shape, or you'll feel better, or you'll accomplish the task that you set out to do. And so learning that repeatedly, because, initially in the military, the discipline is imposed from on high that, you better do this. Otherwise, you'll get court-martialed, or you'll be, severely punished in some way. But then later, over time, I gradually learned to impose it on myself and realized, even if in the short term it's painful or unpleasant, in the long run, good things will happen if you inflict sort of short-term pain for long-term goals. And so that was like sort of another sort of agentic realization of like, do these things, commit these actions, your actions matter more than your words or how you feel. And then, following those sort of led me later to go to college and develop the habits and the self-discipline and go on and get a PhD and so on, write a book, write a PhD thesis, like, all these sort of things. So yeah, I think it's, learning that very early is important. Especially when you don't, for me, it was really important because I didn't have it when I was a kid. I didn't have anyone sort of looking over my shoulder to make sure I was doing my homework or make sure that I was doing the things that you needed to do. And so I learned those lessons maybe later than many people do.
On the category of rewards, one thing I've been thinking about recently that I don't know how relevant it is or if it's a limiting factor is internal locus of control versus external locus of control. Are you needing an outside influence before you get started? Or do you just go from nowhere? It's kind of like leadership of your own. How do you go from one to the other? Or are people stuck as one and just you have to do the best you can with the way you're wired?
Well, I think it sort of depends on the context. So there is, that's like a very famous framework from psychology, the internal versus external locus of control. Internal is, are you self-driven and self-motivated, versus external is, do you need someone else to sort of put incentives and penalties in place for you to behave in a certain way? I think it's an important distinction, and it maybe will help you to predict certain things. I mean, people who have an internal locus of control do on average go on to be more successful in their lives because they're self-driven and self-motivated. But I would actually say in some ways, like having good influences and good environments and structure, it's even more important for people with external locus of control, because I didn't have that much of an internal locus of control for example, when I first enlisted. I was just kind of this wayward, aimless teenager, and the military was this external force that did kind of drill into me the things that I needed to do to become more conscientious and focused and disciplined, and then kind of allowed me to become more internally driven in terms of locus of control. So, I think like we do have, especially in like American society at large, that we do like the idea of like freedom and letting people do their thing and sort of leaving people alone. And I think like generally that's like a good kind of default position, is like letting people, as long as you're not hurting anyone, do your thing. But I think when you implement that approach for kids, like kids actually do need some discipline, some control, someone looking out for them. I mean, if you let a kid completely have, total freedom, they're just going to, I mean, I had almost complete freedom as a kid, and it just allowed me to make a lot of bad decisions. I mean, I was, I started drinking beer when I was 5. I was drinking tequila when I was 9. I was smoking weed and cigarettes, 9, 10 years old, taking pills. Like, if you want to do those things when you're an adult and no one, you're not hurting anyone and no one relies on you, fine, be who you are. But when you're 9 years old, I just don't think that's not a good way to live. It's not, healthy for kids to live that kind of life. And so it would be nice if we could be a bit more willing to say that, there are better and worse ways for kids to exist in the world. You know, if we want to take a non-judgmental attitude to the choices adults make, fine. But then if there are kids involved, if they have children, if there are people who rely on those adults, then I think we could be a bit more, you know, we could be a bit more, I guess, judgmental or a bit more concerned with how things are going for those young kids, because you know, in the long run, those kids are going to grow up and end up living, you know, the same or worse lives that they're currently living as kids. I mean, so I talk about this. I had 5 close friends growing up, and we were all doing the same things, you know, and I'm the anomaly, you know, like I'm the sort of outlier in that group. But the typical outcome of someone who grew up the way that we did, the sort of modal outcome is, you know, so of my 5 friends, 2 went to prison. One of my good friends was shot to death when we were in high school. You know, the other, and then yeah, my other friends are kind of working menial jobs, kids with different women, and they don't see any of them. You know, just kind of living that carefree, irresponsible life. And again, like if you're just a single guy and you don't have kids and you don't have anyone relying on you, you know, do your thing. But once you have, you know, 3 kids from 3 different women, maybe it's time to be an adult and be someone who they can rely on instead of cutting off contact and, you know, trying to, I mean, I have, you know, now, yeah, guys I went to high school with, they're like in their 30s now, enrolled in community college, smoking a lot of weed, trying to sleep with 18-year-olds. Like, you know, it's just, that's not a good life. But that is the typical outcome of someone that grew up the way that we did. So it would be nice if we could sort of focus on, you know, the kids that they have are going to grow up the same way, unless we can, you know, to some extent intervene and say, like, maybe there are better ways to raise kids and to think about the kind of environments they're growing up in. So,
is there something to the idea of enforcing or supporting structure early on in life, kind of like the older generation tends to do, until the person has enough structure such that they can base or put creativity on top of that, or have freedom on top of that once the structure's already there? Does everybody have to pay the structure tax before they can blossom?
Structure tax, I like that.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think everybody does. There are people who are just like sort of by nature I mean, I guess like kids, I don't know if you like you want to think about it in those, like, you know, does an 8-year-old have to pay the structure tax? But just like, yeah, have some oversight, right? Like it would be good for little kids to have some parents around and to have their best interest in mind. But I think so. I mean, this is you know, maybe we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, but I coined this idea of luxury beliefs. And I think one luxury belief that many kind of educated, upper middle class, conscientious people have is that, you know, because a certain way of life works for them, that everybody should live that way too. That, you know, if you're, you know, a highly educated person with comfortable material circumstances and you're earning money and you have a degree and you live a life of, you know, very little threat to your day-to-day existence, then you can live in a structureless way, you know, clock in and clock out whenever you want. You don't need much oversight if you're trying to do your job or get a task done. But most people aren't like that. You know, most people do need a bit of structure in their life, and they need a bit of sort of oversight and supervision and those kinds of things. I mean, it just, you know, even if in the short term it's unpleasant, right, in the longer term, it will make their lives beneficial. I'm thinking of a friend of mine that I went to high school with. When we were 19, he was working at Burger King. I was in the military. I was visiting home. So he was working at Burger King. He was talking about how he wanted more hours. He wanted a job that paid better. He just, you know, he wanted to sort of, at least this is what he claimed he wanted. And so we were at Applebee's as we were having this conversation. And I was like, why don't you apply? Like, I saw like a help wanted or some kind of sign out front. This place is hiring. You know, why not fill out an application here? Or at least ask, like, are you hiring full-time workers? And at first he kind of, you know, he was like, rebuffed me. He's like, nah, this is stupid. You know, I don't know. So I went up and got an application for him, and we filled it out together at the table. And he got an interview, and then he got the job, and then on his first day he just didn't go. And you know, I remember talking to him about this, and he was like, yeah, I just didn't feel like it, you know. It's like, I woke up, I was kind of high, I was kind of, bored, thinking about work. I just didn't want to do it. And a couple of years later, he was riding his motorcycle, had someone on the back with him. He was drunk. He might have been high too. And some police officer saw and started chasing him through the freeway. And my friend tried to outrun him on this motorcycle. He ended up crashing into an on-ramp, and he survived with some minor scrapes and bruises. But the person who was on the back of the motorcycle fractured their skull and was in a coma. And it's not impossible to say that, like, oh, and he ended up going to prison as a result of that, because that was like his third or fourth alcohol related incident that he was arrested for. So it's not impossible to say that if he'd had a bit more structure and discipline and oversight in his life, if someone was, or if he had grown up with good habits and good discipline, and someone telling him it's important to show up to work on time and get a job and sort of color within the lines, at least when you're young, that the person who he was riding with wouldn't have been so seriously injured. My friend may not have gone to prison. He may have lived a very different life, but because he lived a completely structureless childhood and adolescence and early adulthood, it's basically like, whatever I feel in the moment is the right thing to do. If it feels good, do it. And that was enough for him. Whereas for most people, that's not the right philosophy to life. Is, if it feels good, well, reconsider. And is this, what are the long-term consequences of this? And again, like, if you live a certain kind of life, upper middle class, educated, everything, like, you probably don't even have that much of an urge to get drunk and ride a motorcycle in the first place. Maybe you have the urge to get high or drunk or something, but you're aware, right? Like, especially if you grew up with parents and you sort of have that structure in place of, like, the long-term effects or the potential outcomes of drinking and riding a motorcycle. So anyway, yeah, I think structurelessness works for some people, but for most people it doesn't.
It makes sense. I like your bringing up of luxury beliefs as well. There's something there, even with your motorcycle example, there's something to the idea that luxury beliefs is sort of like, if this is not exactly the way you bring it up, but just as an example, like Michael Jordan not remembering how he started playing and then just saying things of like, just do this and this and this, let's say, and then the person starting there couldn't get there. Or somebody in a successful scenario, like, oh, I'm not able to meet people. And then let's say I don't use a podcast example, just bring them on your podcast. Well, I don't have one. Or like in the motorcycle example, the person often that does the accident in a vehicle or causes it every single time, not every single time, quite often gets less injured than the other person that was in the other car that got hit, or the person in the back that wasn't actually driving. There's something to you already got there and you're not bringing the ladder up for other people to get there as well. Luxury beliefs have a bit of coldness to them, because if you did pull people up to where you are actually smoothly, then there wouldn't be that gap.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Well, so luxury beliefs, I coined this term in 2019, a few years ago. Luxury beliefs. I developed this when I was doing my PhD. They're ideas and opinions that confer status on the upper class while inflicting costs on the lower classes. People who are very affluent hold a set of beliefs. It makes them look good. It sort of increases their prestige in the eyes of others. But then once those ideas get implemented into culture or into policy, this often has sort of catastrophic, detrimental downstream consequences for everyone else. A key component of a luxury belief is that the believer is sheltered from the consequences of his or her belief. And so when you have someone like, someone saying, that, often what happens with people who are upwardly mobile, someone like me, or someone like others who have gone on to some extent manage to rise above their early experiences, often we're surprised when we encounter people who denigrate like the very principles that fueled our rise, right? Like, hard work doesn't matter, or it all comes down to luck, or who your family is, or who or basically like and often those same people themselves, like, even if they sort of started ahead of you, they work hard too. I mean, it's very hard to actually be successful without working hard, regardless of what you may have heard. Like because I've seen this, right? Like by now I've spent enough time around people who've graduated elite colleges, and there are people who came from like maybe moderate, upper middle class families who are extremely hardworking strivers who, it still takes a ton of work to get into certain kinds of occupations and earn a certain level of income and so on. And I also know the children of rich people who had a trust fund, who had like, instead of being at like the 90th percentile of socioeconomic status, they're at the 99th percentile, which is actually quite a big, it's a big enough difference to where if you're at the 90th percentile, you still have to work for a living. If you're at the 99th percentile, you no longer have to work. So the people with trust funds, and they actually aren't that successful, objectively speaking. Like, yes, they wear expensive clothes and have a trust fund and everything, but like they didn't earn that. And they find it difficult actually to get a good job and to make money on their own and to get a high paying job because they aren't willing to work hard, or they're just they grew up a little bit too comfortable. And so point being there that you do have to work hard to be successful regardless of where you started, and that even very rich kids who start at like at home plate, they can't get the jobs that they want if they're not willing to put in the effort for it. And so but people in both of those categories, upper middle class and upper class people, repeatedly I encountered this attitude of like, hard work and effort, like, meritocracy is a myth, it's who you know or who you whatever, the connections, or it's about schmoozing and bullshitting, and it's not, the whole system is a scam. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, they're frantically working as hard as they possibly can and putting in, 100 hours a week to get the promotion or whatever. And to me, there's like a duplicity there, right? Like, why are you telling the world that you don't have to work hard, and then behind the scenes you're working as hard as you possibly can? It just seems to me like, when people ask me, especially like young kids, if I'm volunteering or tutoring or speaking with kids who grew up in similar circumstances that I did, like I'm not going to tell them, oh, it's all just a scam and you don't have to work hard and it's who you know, and it's very demoralizing. I would never tell them that. I would say, like, if you want to get good grades, you're going to have to study. If you want to go to college, you're going to have to work hard and put in the effort and fill out the scholarship applications and, hopefully try to form some decent connections with teachers or your guidance counselor. You're going to have to behave like and you have to work twice as hard as other people to get to the same point as them because you started out so much earlier. I mean, it's actually worse to spread the work doesn't matter message to people when work actually matters that much more for them because of how impoverished their early lives are. So yeah, I mean, it's not I mean, it's like the epitome of a luxury belief, this downplaying of hard work and downplaying of effort.
It's something cold about it to me, because it's saying I am here, you are there, and then the actual way to get here, I'm not going to showcase that. And also I'm going to talk about something that sort of puts me in a bubble up here, similar to, you had brought up an example with person that was from parents that were together, and then recommending people not get married or have children, but would still get married and have children. So you're doing this thing that will basically negate these genes from the next generation, but yours will continue on.
I've never thought of it in those terms, but yeah.
It's like, boom, take out these adenines and thymines, we'll keep these guanines and cysteines. So there's something to that, and it's like a bubbling. It's like the opposite of what teachers do to take a student to the next thing. You have to take them through a track of learning. And if you don't do that, well, they're stuck at that point. Is there a coldness to it? Is it them wanting to feel better about where they got to, trying to up where they got to and keep others out?
Well, okay, so yeah, I mean, the example you gave, I read about this experience, which is that, I was speaking to this young woman that I went to college with, and somehow we got around to talking about marriage and family and stuff, and she was like, oh, monogamy and marriage, I mean, these are kind of outdated structures, they're kind of, she used the term patriarchal and oppressive and these kinds of things, and I'm listening to her, and I'm like, and this was like, I was still in college, and I still hadn't like fully mastered the vocabulary of elite universities and all these terms, but one thing I just asked her was like, well, how did you grow up? Like, what was your early life experience like? And she was like, well, I was raised by my mom and my dad and like had, that kind of conventional family life. And I said, okay, what, like, once, because she was planning to go to law school, she was going to have a successful career and everything. I asked her, like, well, what do you plan to do later? Like, are you going to have a family? Like, what would you like to do yourself? And she was like, well, I'll probably get married and get a husband and have a family that way, but she was like, just because I'm going to do it doesn't mean everybody should have to do it. And basically what she was saying was, I benefited from this sort of age-old institution of stable two family structure that, created the conditions for me to go to a place like Yale. I plan to carry the benefits of that tradition forward for my own children when I get married and have kids. But her official public position was, you shouldn't do this thing, right? This thing that led me to be successful and that I plan to carry forward to make my children successful is actually, is there an element of duplicity, or is it, because people ask me this, is it conscious? Is it all just about, are they sort of coldly calculating to get status or something? And, I've thought about this for a long time. I think, there's not one answer. I would say that, and this is just like, if I were to put an estimate, it's hard to say, but 10 to 20%, I would say, are actually like cold and calculating in these ways. And I've met these people who will, sort of in private, maybe after they've had a couple of cocktails, they'll say like, there are winners and losers in this world. And sometimes you have to, take certain strategies to weed out the competition. And they talk in these terms. But I think that's a kind of numerical minority. I would say 80% plus are not really thinking that deeply about it. They just realize like, oh, these are beliefs that are fashionable and prestigious and that are, they seem to make me look good to my peers. And they sound, on their surface, they sound good. Marriage is outdated and it makes you sound interesting and progressive. Or, actually we live in this corrupt society where hard work doesn't matter. And, if you're not doing well in your life, it's not your fault and it's okay. And, it makes you sound like a sympathetic, compassionate person in the moment. And they don't really think ahead like, well, okay, well, let's extrapolate. What are the downstream consequences of if that belief were to spread throughout society and get to the point where people no longer feel like they can get ahead in their lives, or people think that, everywhere they turn, it's like, at the least marriage is questioned, or more often like marriage is ridiculed or undermined or thought to be outdated or something. It's one thing to have these fashionable beliefs if you grew up relatively well off and in a way that you didn't have to worry about day-to-day survival or whether your children would be successful. But for people who are struggling and trying to climb up that ladder, essentially you're kind of, kicking it down or adding grease to the rungs and confusing people, right? Like, I'm thinking about like this story that just came to mind was, when I was in high school, I had two jobs. I was a dishwasher at this restaurant. I was a dishwasher and busboy, and I got this job as a bag boy at a supermarket because it paid a little bit more. And I remember I was nervous when I had to tell my restaurant manager that I was quitting my dishwashing busboy job to go work at this grocery store. And, because I'd worked there and he and I had a good relationship, and he was, he looked out for me within the workplace. And I told him about this and he was proud. And he was like, this is exactly what you want, Rob. Like, you want each job you get to be better than the one you had before. And that's what you're doing. He's like, I know no one wants to be sweating their ass off in a steaming hot dish room in a restaurant and, cleaning other people's leftovers and, So, like, I'd come home and my fingernails would smell like garlic and onions. And I just, it's kind of, it's disgusting. No one wants to wash dishes, for a living, but, it was a good experience for me. But then, that message that he delivered to me was, I'm proud of you. That's a good thing. But I could easily imagine, some highly educated person coming, if they witnessed that interaction without knowing like how things would end up, just like, just so you're actually just working a dead end job. And this other job, is it really so much better? It's just another dead end job. You're making, this is mid 2000s in California. You're making $6.75 an hour, and now you're making $7.25. Like, is it really such a big leap? Statistically, the odds are against you, and there's all these forces, these impersonal forces that are holding you back. And if I were to receive that message from prominent media outlets or people who seemed to know what they're talking about, experts and pundits and smart people, and they're just saying like you're just trapped in a dead end cycle of poverty or something, I think that would have been demoralizing. But instead, I was getting this good advice from my restaurant manager, who himself was an ex-felon, who had lived a very hard life and knew sort of how to get ahead, how to sort of correct the mistakes of your past and try to improve your circumstances. And I'm glad I listened to my restaurant manager, who had spent time in prison, rather than some pundit who got a lot of education from an expensive university.
There's a theme that's very prevalent of you've seen all the different rungs of society struggle, people who have struggled, you in a good scenario, other people in a good scenario, high status, lower status, the effects on the person in those moments. How many rungs are there? And I once spoke about the meritocracy trap many years ago with an author. And is there a lot of separation between the world of the bottom 50% versus the next 40% versus the next 9% versus the next 0.9% versus the top 0.1%? Are they all playing completely different games? Do they communicate informatively to one another?
I mean, not really. In terms of the communication, right? Like, we're just becoming more and more. I mean, we talk a lot about like political polarization, which does exist, but I think there's a lot of class polarization too. That people who grow up in more blue collar, kind of working class or poor environments, they live one way of life and have a certain outlook, and then people who are highly educated and they just have different concerns. I mean, probably the average person who went to, especially as someone who went to like an expensive college and who works a white collar job, they've probably never had like a 20-minute conversation with someone who didn't get a bachelor's degree, right? Like that's just how things are going now, where you have this reshuffling. And to some extent, there's a political component here too, but I think a lot of it is class as well, where I criticize this idea in my book about, I think I call it trickle down meritocracy, or you could call it trickle down diversity, which is this idea that, the belief seems to be, at least among, whatever you want to call them, the elite, the luxury belief class, I call them, is as long as that top segment of society, perfectly represents the demographics of America as a whole, then things are fine, right? Like, as long as it's 50% women and this percent Asian and this percent that and the other, then we've done our job and we have diversity or we have representation or something. And the point that I make in the book is like, that's great for those people who were handpicked to be a part of that, anointed class. But what about all of the other people who are struggling? And what about all of the people who don't go on to, obtain positions of influence or power or get a seat at some expensive college? I mean, it's often what actually ends up happening is that these elite institutions, I mean, speaking specifically about colleges, is that they strip mine talented people out of their communities, and then those people end up going to live in cities with other college graduates, and they don't end up going back home. And again, like, I'm not like condemning them or blaming them. Like, I'm not going to go back to Red Bluff, California, where I grew up. But if the original intent of these institutions was to somehow, it is like this trickle down thing of like, oh, if we just, put enough people from marginalized people into the elite, then those benefits will somehow trickle down to everyone else, and this will, lift all boats or something. But instead, like, there's no evidence of this, right? Like, marginalized communities are still struggling. People who are poor are still poor. Like, just because maybe someone who kind of looks like them went to Harvard, like, what does that mean for you? Like, what does it mean? Like, I guess I'm trying to translate some of my experiences to help other kids who grew up in foster care or something. But like, just at a sort of superficial level, the fact that I went on to get a degree or something, like, how is that? Like, what is the line between that and kids who are currently in the foster system, right? Like, I don't understand why this is, instead of focusing on trickle down diversity, why don't we actually sort of look at what's going on in these communities, how we can improve them, what we can do. in it, not instead of helping them financially, but alongside that, what are some good habits, some good customs, some good pieces of advice uh, for how you should live your life that will, what actions can you take that will help you to be happier and to live a more sort of flourishing and satisfying life. And yeah, are they playing different games? That's an interesting question. I mean, yeah, kind of, right? Like there are like there's a great book that was written decades ago by Paul Fussell called Class, a Guide Through the American Status System, and he talks about how within each, I mean, this is a simplification to some extent, but basically he says that within each class, the ingredients that indicate your position are different, and so for the roughly speaking, like the lower class, the poor and the working class, that bottom segment, it's about money, and it is kind of a money game of like, do you have a nice car? Can you afford to buy a boat? What does your house look like? Those kinds of things. And I remember when I was growing up, it was like a lot of concentration and discussion about money. Some of my coworkers play the lottery. My mom still plays the lottery. My adoptive mom, they have this like pool at her workplace where like every week it's someone's job to like buy tickets for the group and whatever. And like somehow I don't know how they've decided to divvy it up, but if someone wins the lottery, they like will divide it among the 7 of them or something. And so it's about money. And in the middle class, Paul Fussell says, class is about education. It's like, did you go to the right college, or, are you, where did you get your degree? Do you have a master's degree? How level, how many degrees do you have, and which institutions did you attend? And there's a lot of preoccupation about college. And then for the upper class, class is primarily about your tastes, your customs, your habits, how you carry yourself, the kind of restaurants you like, the kind of cuisines you enjoy, the entertainment that you consume, sort of having intricate and expensive interests and tastes and hobbies. And, these aren't like perfectly rigid, right? Like the upper class still cares about money and the middle class still cares to some extent about taste, but these are kind of the primary ways that classes are distinguished under this framework. And I think there's quite a bit of truth to it, because if you're like born to like the Rockefellers or the Kennedys or something, and you don't go to an expensive college, and you yourself don't work, and you're actually like objectively not very wealthy, but you have spent your whole childhood and adolescence immersed in the sort of the behaviors of the gentry, of like being a well-mannered person who knows a lot about art and wine and history and these kinds of things. Even if you yourself, objectively have like a low balance on your bank account, and maybe you didn't go to the most expensive college in the world, that people will, within that social category, within the upper class, will still recognize you as one of them. Whereas if you're in the upper class and you see some, nouveau riche, person who, some like Great Gatsby-esque figure who rises up and, gets the degrees and gets the money, and to some extent maybe at least superficially manages to look like a member of the upper class, they won't fully consider you as part of them. They'll be able to tell there are certain subtle errors in the way that you speak, or the way you carry yourself, or the way that you dress, or the way that you think, or the, your table manners, something along those lines, where they'll be able to pinpoint like, oh, you're actually, you're a new, what is it? You're a revista, you're a parvenu, you're a newly arrived, you're not truly one of them. Your kids can be, right? Like this is one of the things that Fussell and Pierre Bourdieu and other sort of sociologists of class write about, is like, you are the class that you're born into. Your kids can join the next class if you achieve some upward mobility, and you enroll your kids into the right schools and sort of start them from birth on that track. They can join that upper class, but you yourself can never fully be a part of it.
That's like it wasn't in your 0 to 10 years old, so you don't get to have that. But if it's in there 0 to 10 years old, okay, they actually fully believe it. We don't know if you fully believe it in that case.
Yeah.
That's funny. When you mentioned strip mining earlier, a set of qualities, it made me think of something slightly segued, but is society, as it's become very specialized and segmented, have we, I call it vacuuming, but like vacuumed or strip mined everything? So like the best looking people in society were scouted and they're at some modeling thing. And then the most intelligent people were scouted and they're in the tech company. And whatever, all the features one by one, so that if you're a regular part of common society, so much has been vacuumed out, and then the best sales is in Amazon's workforce to get the best deals. Like everything one by one has been pulled from society, such that what does that leave us in the broad range of public society? Is there something to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like I think there is, especially in America, like this hyper efficient capitalist system, and I like capitalism, whatever, but like it's not costless, right? Like it does have effects. Like once you have a completely um, free system where people can make their own decisions and associate and make their own choices in life, there's this political philosopher who uh, was at Harvard back in the 90s. I think he's passed away now, Robert Nozick, but he had this, the bumper sticker idea was liberty upsets patterns, which is like when you give people freedom, like things are just going to move around very quickly, and however, whatever the starting point happens to be in society, as soon as you let people make their choices, inequality is naturally going to arise. People are going to, people with talents are going to monetize them. They're going to earn a lot of money. People who don't have those same level of talents are going to be more impoverished. The power laws and some people call it the Matthew principle. I mean, these things will take effect. And so I think in America, you see it more so than in Europe or other places where if you're a good looking person, you learn very quickly that you're good looking. And yeah, maybe modeling scout or maybe social media, or you become an influencer, or you just discover that there's a way for you to use that, unearned attribute to, rise up and earn some money and get out of wherever you are. If you're very smart or talented or creative or interesting in some way, now especially with the internet and everything else, right? Like power laws reign where people are certain people are becoming very successful and others are falling behind or are unable to fully sort of make their way. Just the inequality sort of seems to be magnifying in some sense. I don't know if that's, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, it's good in the sense that people are able to earn money and capitalize on their talents, but I do think like there is room for a safety net. There is room for, if you are born unlucky or particularly untalented or unattractive or something, that there should be something available for you. And this is like one of those things where, we touched on this before about this preoccupation with these, extrinsic conventional badges of success. It's like the guys that I grew up with, I think that the ones that went to prison, if they'd had different upbringings and different lives, they probably wouldn't have been incarcerated. If they'd had different upbringings, would they have gone to Yale? Honestly, if I'm being completely honest, probably not. Um, but that's okay. I mean, just because you don't have the whatever, like just because you weren't like you were not born. You didn't earn those things. You're born with certain things, and to some extent, there's environment and all these factors. But by and large, a lot of the talents and attributes that are monetizable that we have, we didn't earn them in some sort of objective sense. But there are other ways to achieve satisfaction in life, and it seems like more and more we are sort of crowding out those other sources or pillars of meaning. I made this point in one of my essays about luxury beliefs, that the sort of denigration of religion or family, for example, that if you're not a super smart or a super talented or super successful person in some professional material sense, at least, historically, you could still sort of derive satisfaction. Even if you work a job that isn't especially exciting, you could say like, well, I go to work every day and I'm providing for my family and people rely on me, and I have my spouse and my kids, or I'm taking care of my kids and they love me and I'm making sure that they're being raised properly and that they feel loved. You can derive a lot of satisfaction from that. But often, more and more, it seems like we're sort of denigrating the importance of marriage. We're denigrating the importance of child rearing. I think religion historically has served an important function for people to derive some satisfaction. If you're, talented or creative or born lucky in some way, you can derive satisfaction from your work. You can have like a creative class job. You can be a writer or podcaster or whatever. Like you can sort of work the kind of job that seems to impress people. Or you can partake, if you're born rich and you don't have to work, you can travel, you can develop fun hobbies, you can become a photographer, whatever, an amateur mixologist or something. You can find ways to like seek fulfillment in your life. But if you're born unlucky and not particularly wealthy and all these kinds of things, what are your options before you to live a fulfilling life? I think it used to be, and to some extent you can still do this, is to find a partner, find some satisfaction in your community, in your relationship, in your church, in your, there are sort of small scale ways to do this, and the sources of meaning seem to be shrinking more and more, and part of this may be what you had mentioned earlier, that if you're born with any kind of special talent or whatever, you end up leaving those places. You're either not born there, or if you are, you leave, and then you forget what it's like there. You forget what life is like for most of those people and what their options are. And, there's a lot of discussion about like, just, I mentioned the social safety net earlier, which I think is important, but like UBI, or just like, to me, it just sounds like, almost like that Marie Antoinette, let them eat UBI. Like let them eat cake, right? Like just throw them $1,500 a month, give them some money in their account, and just stop complaining. But actually, like having money deposited into your account doesn't immediately translate into life satisfaction. It can help. It's better than not having it, but there are other pathways to living a life that leads to happiness and to a life that you feel proud to have lived.
The point you just brought up reminds me of one time Tupac said that I can't live in the city where I grew up. Why? Because they'll rob me. I have to move to this city because now I'm this. So I can't even live with the people that I grew up with because now I'm of an upper class. So I couldn't even be around them. It's like a segmentation that happens. I have like 9,000 other topics that I would like to include, but we'll leave those for a future discussion. One last one I want to include: your book, to be released, getting it out there. Is it a smooth process? What does that involve? Any hiccups along the way?
So my book, it's out February 20th. It's been kind of 5+ years in the making, writing this book and, going through the whole sort of publishing process. There've been a few hiccups along the way. Writing it was difficult, but, it ended up coming together. But yeah, more recently, man, like I've been trying to, speaking with my publisher and agent and trying to, maybe do some book events. We were thinking about doing one, here in California, and then maybe another one in New York. And my publisher, they're telling me they're having a difficult time getting bookstores interested in hosting my book, which I find very interesting. Like there are authors who are doing book events who, they don't seem to have quite the same kind of online footprint or following, but maybe they tick the right boxes. Their maybe outlook is more flattering to the people who run the bookstores. And to me, it honestly just feels more like, what I mentioned before about how if you regardless of what you have achieved in your life, if you started from a certain point, you're never going to be fully accepted, right? So you can be someone like me, growing up in foster homes, serving in the military, somehow managing to like break myself in half to get into Yale and then to Cambridge, and then to get a mainstream book publisher and write this book and try to communicate these difficult early life experiences of living in the foster homes and everything. The people who run bookstores are uninterested in that story, despite the fact that I could probably draw like a relatively large audience, because I'm not one of them and probably never will be. So yeah, that's just how things stand right now in this country, and it's kind of sad, because I think it's not I don't think it's going to necessarily long-term affect book sales, anything like that. Like doing a bookstore event is not going to be like a game-changing whatever, but it would have been nice to have a venue there to meet some readers and meet people who maybe would like to ask questions, or maybe people who wouldn't ordinarily hear about stories like this. I mean, in the end, I would like to do events maybe for some foster care organizations or boys and girls clubs or after-school programs. Like I want to be able to talk to directly to kids who have had similar experiences to me. But yeah, I just thought, let's do a bookstore event. It's an obvious thing, right? I'm an author. I wrote a book. Let's do something at a bookstore. But apparently they don't like the book. They think maybe it's too controversial or polarizing, which is sad. But yeah, that's where things stand. If you're an outsider as an author, even if you would think that maybe they would be interested in stories from outsiders and people who've had unique experiences. Even if they say that, that's not always the case.
A duplicitous nature among the world.
That exists, yes.
Classic. Rob, author of Troubled, I'd like to thank you for having joined on this discussion and a future one so I can go over the notes I didn't go over this time.
All right. Thanks, Armin.
And we are out.